Mark Coase spent 20 years as a special agent in the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. Until he retired last year, Coase also spent 30 years in the Marines, most of that time in the reserves. He's in this Defense Department video shot at Camp Pendleton in 2011.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mark Coase. I'm the commanding officer of 5th Battalion, 14th Marines.
Coase's artillery brigade was practicing in the California desert.
When we come out for our annual training, we're able to exercise the metals that we need to on an artillery battalion that you just can't get done in the 2 to 3 days on a drill weekend.
The U.S. relied heavily on Guard and reserves after 9/11. By 2011, Coase had already served 4 tours in Iraq as a Marine Reserve officer while on leave from the DEA. He's now part of a lawsuit with 15 other DEA agents from San Diego who allege that their supervisors discriminated against agents serving in the military.
Never in my wildest dreams did I or any of my colleagues assume that we would get the most grief coming from our office, meaning government agents. That was the most incredible thing that I experienced as a result of the wars.
Coase says he and other reservists were denied promotions at DEA. He describes another agent who was moved to an office hours away from his home. Coase says one of his supervisors came up to him in the mailroom after he had just come back from his first tour in Iraq.
He was asking me about my experience there, and I said, yeah, it was pretty hard, fighting up to Baghdad, and I said I got wounded at one point. And he said, well, if you hadn't stayed in the reserve, this wouldn't have happened, so you pretty much deserve everything you get.
The DEA won't comment on ongoing litigation. In the U.S. Justice Department, Patrick Boley heads the Office of the Special Counsel, which enforces the Federal Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, or USERRA.
This law helps keep our military all volunteer by, giving people employment protections and protections against discrimination when they're trying to get a civilian job.
The law requires the federal government to be the model employer, but over the last decade, out of the more than 11,800 cases filed through the Department of Labor, about 17% were filed against the federal government. The worst offenders are the agencies most closely tied to the military. Civilians in the Department of Defense filed the most cases, followed by the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Postal Service, and Homeland Security, which has the Coast Guard and Border Patrol.
One could argue that it's because they employ a lot of veterans and service members, but of course, we also want those agencies to be doing their best not to violate the law.
Boulay says he believes in the vast reaches of the federal government there are supervisors who just don't understand the law. Though one problem with USERRA is it's designed to get relief for individuals. Boulay says he can't force an entire agency to change its policies toward reservists. Brian Lawler is a retired Marine Reserve aviator and a San Diego lawyer who handles USERRA cases. He says in 2018, a federal circuit court ruled on the amount of paid leave federal reservists are allowed.
I still, every other week, an agency will say, we don't agree with that decision, which they can say, but I know how it's going to turn out in the end.
Lawler says half of his cases are federal workers.
We represent a gentleman who is a senior officer in the Army Reserve and a senior civilian employee working for the exact same command, and who is being denied benefits of his reserve service by the same command for whom he works as a civilian.
At the moment, the process is even slower. The Merit Systems Protection Board, which oversees appeals by federal workers, hasn't met in more than a year. The Trump administration was slow to offer appointments, and the Senate hasn't confirmed any new members. The board has a backlog of 2,300 cases waiting for its review. Steve Walsh, KPBS News.